All the sunglasses at the bottom of the stairs. Dennis Hopper. Edwin Canestracci here. I'm back, and I am back to discuss one of my favorite filmmakers, but also one of my favorite actors, but I'm here to focus on his films, the films that Dennis Hopper directed as a filmmaker. That's going to be my focus. I'll touch upon all his films, but with most of my focus being on four particular films that I think are his four masterpieces. Drinking a little Nelson's Greenbrier Tennessee Sour Mash whiskey. This is the real stuff. It's from a local brewery that's not too far from me. It's really good stuff. Nice family-owned business. They ain't paying for advertisement. I'm just drinking the stuff, and I like to give credit where credit's due. Cheers. Dennis Hopper, he's an icon, he's a legend. I feel like most people, when they talk about Dennis Hopper, if they talk about Dennis Hopper, they are thinking of him in terms of being an actor or just a general personality. Eccentric, iconoclastic actor that was very famous for playing villains later in his life. And of course, Easy Rider. People will talk about Easy Rider, and I'm going to get into Easy Rider, so we'll talk all about that. Dennis Hopper is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated filmmakers of the 20th century. And I think he was an amazing filmmaker. I especially got really into a big kick, and a lot of my Facebook friends will know about this. About a year ago, I had read Brooke Hayward was Dennis Hopper's wife throughout the 60s, and they were like the it couple in Los Angeles throughout the 60s, from the early to late 60s, and it was a book detailing how important they were to the cultural scene of LA and how much they helped really shape that city and New Hollywood and change culture as we know it. And also detailing, the troubled marriage, especially in the later stages, and, how crazy Dennis could get. Everyone knows how crazy Dennis got. Some of these anecdotes about Dennis Hopper were legendary, going back to when I first read Easy Rider's Raging Bulls back in the day. That's a legendary Hollywood book, so you definitely got to read that if you never did. And yeah, Dennis, he was a crazy guy, and not always a nice guy. He'd be the first to say it. I mean, this is a man who David Lynch said when he was auditioning to play Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, told David Lynch that this character is me. I have to play this character because this character is who I am. And David Lynch would always joke and saying, like, on one hand, he was happy to find his Frank Booth, but on the other hand, he was a little weary of this guy that identified as being similar to Frank Booth, because Frank Booth is a crazy, sadistic, fucked up individual. Dennis Hopper, he's like, yep, that's me. It's no surprise that he would eventually be more than just an actor, because in the early 60s, he was a renowned photographer. Yes, he was a photographer, and he ran around with his camera taking pictures all the time. And that's when he really started to, I think, develop his eye as a director, was via his photography. His most famous picture he took was a photograph in the early 60s. It's called Double Standard. Amazing photograph. It's a work of art. Dennis Hopper himself, he referred to his photographs as found paintings. These photographs, I mean, not only amazing photographs of LA, but amazing photographs of leading cultural figures at the time, Andy Warhol, Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, a lot of amazing photographs of them. He took some very important photographs of MLK, Martin Luther King, at the Selma Civil Rights March. He really documented the 60s and the changing times with his photography. So it's no surprise that he would then document the counterculture, and perhaps the most iconic cinematic reflection of the counterculture with Easy Rider.
Hollywood. Dun, Hollywood.
This film, Easy Rider. Of course, I have the Criterion Collection edition. Amazing film. Amazing edition. Highly recommend it. Easy Rider, I think a thing about Easy Rider, though, they always talk about the phenomenon of Easy Rider. It's a reflection of its time, and it's the issuing in of New Hollywood, and the first time that the hippie culture kind of entered the cinematic mainstream. Because even though in the rock world and via the Beatles and the Stones and other artists in the mid-60s, it had already encroached and taken over the mainstream in the music scene. But if you looked at what movies were like in like the late 60s, it hadn't fully taken shape yet in Hollywood. Hollywood was a little more conservative, and you would have some movies here and there where there would be like a scene where like a middle-aged character would go into a bar and there'd be like a go-go dancer and a few hippies, a few freaks. Like usually it was like kind of a joke, like ah ha ha, look at these young weirdos kind of thing. Or you had like Charles Bronson playing a beatnik. It was kind of obvious that Hollywood was fairly square, especially compared to the music scene. In that sense, Easy Rider was very important in terms of finally catching up, kind of catching up with the music scene and bringing this culture, which by this point people were fully aware of, especially in the cities, but I think even in other rural parts of America, even if it was perhaps demonized in those parts. But by this point, people kind of were expecting and wanting a movie like this, I think. So in that sense, it was part of the zeitgeist, and it did strike a chord because of that, because for the first time, people were seeing reality reflected in a Hollywood movie, which they hadn't seen so much. Like, yes, there were movies like Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate that were definitely pushing things in that direction. But I think 69, I think between Midnight Cowboy and then this film, Easy Rider especially, this is when the floodgates really opened, and it did change cinema as we know it. I think this is really the film that issued in new Hollywood into the early 70s, even more so than Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. But that's what people usually talk about when they talk about Easy Rider. It's cultural significance. It's larger, broader cultural significance. But what they don't talk about is just what it's like as a movie. Just as a movie, in and of itself, independent of the time period that it was created and independent of what it was reflecting at the time period, which it does. You know, Hopper, he does capture it. He does capture that period. But to me, Easy Rider just stands up as a great film, and it's the work of an artist. Yes, you know, Dennis took a lot of credit for everything, including even the screenplay. When Terry Southern did a lot of writing, the great writer Terry Southern, Dennis would try to hog all the glory. But I also think some of that came out of a defensiveness, because I think even out of the gate with Easy Rider, I don't think he was given his full critical due. There was kind of this idea that, oh, he was just this crazy wild guy, and Easy Rider was kind of a happy accident. I think that attitude in itself is one of the reasons why Dennis got so defensive about the film and wanted to grab all the credit for it. But he deserved a lot of credit because he did have the overall vision. You know, some of it came from Peter Fonda, a lot of great dialogue, especially with the George Hansen scenes, which is the character Jack Nicholson played. A lot of that was written by Terry Southern. But overall, the overall vision, I do think, was primarily Dennis Hopper's, and it's consistent with his other work as a director. He was definitely inspired by both Fellini and Jean-Luc Godard. You could tell he was really trying to be the American Godard. I mean, maybe Fellini to a degree, but I think Godard even more so. His films definitely feel more Godardian to me, while bringing in that American X factor, that Hollywood element. In the West, the Old West, he obviously was even dealing with that in this film, and Wyatt and Billy, you know, they're reflecting the outlaws, the old pioneer spirit. Keep in mind, this is also running parallel with the spaghetti Western, so we were already kind of getting the Western myth recontextualized to fit the new breed of outlaws. I think another thing that's reductive about Easy Rider is thinking about it in terms of like hippie culture. Like, yes, there's definitely that scene in the hippie commune, and I think that is a commentary. I think both positive and negative. I think Dennis was always more of an independent. He always struck me that way. Of course, he's famously, people kind of think of him as, oh, he was a left-leaning radical who then became a right-leaning conservative in the 80s. But I always think Dennis was more complicated politically. And I think that you saw these sides. You see both the liberal and conservative sides in Easy Rider. In that film itself, you kind of see the full political spectrum in his view through this film, and it didn't feel like it changed. Even in the 80s and early 90s, you still see there's certain elements. He always was an independent bohemian. He never lost that. He never became an ultra Christian conservative uptight guy. But at the same time, I think he saw where the hedonism could go wrong if unchecked. And I think he struck a healthy balance in the 80s. That conflict is happening in this movie, in Easy Rider. And the characters themselves, I mean, they might have the fashion sense of hippies at that time, but if you listen to what they're saying, as you know, especially Dennis Hopper's character, they're kind of just independent drug dealing outliers that are really just kind of doing things their own way. And they're not really of the hippie culture. They're just kind of mavericks. This is why a lot of bikers like this film. They're not really hippies. They might look like hippies. The Southerners mistake them for hippies because they got long hair and all, but they're really just outlaw drug dealing biker guys. If anything, I think it has a libertarian ethos, this film. One of the things that they admire is the farmer in the beginning that they meet who has a Latino wife and a bunch of kids, and he's just like living off the land. And that's something that they admire and think is cool, although they want to keep going on, especially Hopper's character wants to party, they want to go to Mardi Gras, they want to live it up, and they see the money. There's a great line where Hopper says, like, the money is freedom. It's about freedom. What differentiates who you are is like what the money's for. What do you want to use the money for? And they want to use it for freedom, and that's how they justify the things they do and the path they took. Of course, famously, Fonda's character says we blew it at the end, claimed to be a ab lib on his part, and it could be, because I feel that is more Fonda's commentary than Hopper. Because even just like the characters themselves, I feel they're reflections of who they were as men. And I'd say Peter Fonda is the more traditionally like liberal. And so he would see that what they were doing was somewhat decadent and that they should have gone back and hanged out at the commune. Like, that's the vibe. But you never get the sense of that from Hopper's character, or I think his overall viewpoint. I think it's more like, we're just these maverick guys living the way we want to live. We want to live free. That's what it's about. More of a proto-punk even, I would say, attitude. So it's not a surprise that 10 years later, Dennis Hopper would be diving into the punk rock community and ethos with Out of the Blue. When I look at Easy Rider, I think of this as just a gonzo maverick work of Americana. And it's a beautiful film, too. You got Laszlo Kovac's amazing cinematography. He's one of my favorite cinematographers. He also did The Last Movie, which we'll be discussing, and Five Easy Pieces, Shampoo. Always loved the cinematography in that, and that's one of my favorite movies. Even years later, he would do Ghostbusters, which definitely had some iconic shots. So Laszlo Kovac's amazing cinematographer and an important collaborator, especially for Hopper's first two films. And the images of the road and America as they drive across it, it's breathtaking stuff. And even though he's not the cinematographer, Dennis Hopper, the way he captured LA, the way he captured the Selma Civil Rights March, him and a great cinematographer having discussions and the way that they can capture America. And I've driven across America twice in my life, and this movie definitely captures that feeling. Probably, I would say, better than any movie I've ever seen. It really captures the spacious wonder and splendor of America. And it's still there. It's still there in part, especially like throughout Texas and the Southwest. Like a lot of the area that they cross in this movie, it's still there. It hasn't all been built up yet. And back then, even more so. And then when they get into the deep South, oh, I love that. I mean, the scene where they're driving down a little poor town and the Jimi Hendrix song is playing, I love it. And the soundtrack, too. I would say a lot of people credit The Graduate as kind of the film that introduced like playing pop music with a montage, and it definitely deserves credit for that. But I would argue that the way Hopper worked the music and worked it at the time, pop music, which was rock and roll music at the time, into the film, I think was more innovative and modern in its approach. And it's kind of like how music still to this day is used in a movie. The most famous and iconic use of music is Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild in the opening credits. And I would say like that's like kind of a key music cue, needle drop moment in cinema, because that is how music is still used to this day, like in a trailer or a commercial. And it might seem like almost like it's like something to joke about or a parody, Born to Be Wild, these guys, motorcycles. But you got to keep in mind, like, music wasn't used quite like that, not quite in such a punchy and anthemic way before in a movie. Even like in The Graduate, it's more wistful, it's more romantic. Whereas here, this is what I would call it's like the kick-ass, badass music cue. Like, hey, isn't this a badass thing happening? You still see that to this day. Like, that's how music is used. They'll play a cool rock song, rap song or something while someone's doing something badass. Easy Rider does that throughout the whole goddamn movie. And the story, it's a compelling story. These two guys that sell drugs, they go down Mexico, make a big score, they go up, they sell the coke for a lot of money, and then they put the money in the motorcycle, the Captain America, American flag motorcycle, and they hit the road and they want to go to Mardi Gras to party and to celebrate and then kind of go off in the sunset and kind of live a life as retired, rich, independent guys that just do things their own way and don't have to be a slave to corporate America. And it's a compelling story. It's a compelling story. It's a compelling off-the-grid but on wheels story. The way they intertwine with all these different characters, these different reflections of America at this time. I think especially living in a time period like now where things are very divided in this country as they were then, it feels very relevant to this day. Regardless of your political leanings, you can kind of find something. I said the same thing about Bob Dylan's work. You could kind of find something in this that's kind of can bring everything together. And it's just stunning and evocative and a very important piece of Americana. And that's the thing. It transcends cinema. This is America, this movie. It's America. And it's throughout this whole movie, even at the end when it gets experimental and psychedelic, when they're doing the acid with the prostitutes in New Orleans, it's kind of getting to the soul of America. It's getting to the soul of America and this contrast between beauty, expressionism, war, colonialization, dominance, power, contradictions, hypocrisy, sexuality, violence. It's all there. It's all there. It's in the soil. Not surprising that D.H. Lawrence is referenced, and Dennis Hopper would reference D.H. Lawrence in connection with Native Americans in his later film Backtrack as well, because, and I've talked about this book before, it's one of my favorite books, is D.H. Lawrence's Studies in Classic American Literature, essentially a collection of essays where D.H. Lawrence is trying to find the soul in the soil of America, like what's the authentic America. That's the pursuit of this film, and it's an amazing debut. It's an amazing debut for a filmmaker. This is Dennis Hopper's debut as a filmmaker. And I don't think, even at its time, I don't think he was fully appreciated. And we're going to get more into that when we talk about this next film. This film right here, Last Movie. The Last Movie. Not just any last movie. The Last Movie. This is my favorite Dennis Hopper movie. One of my favorite movies of all time. A big shout out to my buddy Rich, who I've shouted out many times before on this YouTube channel, but Rich of Rich Talks Records, he actually hit me to this movie, which I heard about, but I never watched for years. And he noted that I was on a Dennis Hopper kick because I had just seen the director's cut of Backtrack, which we will discuss in a little while. I was talking up Hopper, and he's like, hey, you should check out this movie, The Last Movie. It's like a Godardian Western. He had me at Godardian. He really had me at Godardian Western because, hey, look, you know, I got my Pro LeFou poster back there. But not only am I into Godard, but as some of you know from my YouTube channel, and perhaps you might know from my hat, I'm into cowboy type shit. So this is like combines two things I'm really into. And it's Dennis Hopper, one of my favorite actors and filmmakers. This movie is fucking legendary, as it should be, but I think for the wrong reasons. It's generally seen as a flawed masterpiece or troubled production or the moment where Dennis Hopper shat the bed and ruined his career, all the promise of Easy Rider. That's the narrative. That's the narrative that everyone kind of associates with this movie. But if you know something about me, I like to upset narratives. Yeah, I like to go against the accepted dogma of canonization. I'm not so hip to canonization. And yes, this film has a cult following. There has been a reappraisal for this great Blu-ray edition and it being re-released in some art house cinemas in the past few years. It definitely has had a reappraisal. But I still think it's like kind of only a film that people in the know kind of know about and appreciate. And to me, it's a natural follow-up to Easy Rider. Although initially it was supposed to be his first film. This was actually the first film Dennis was trying to get off the ground. Like in the mid-60s, he had already kind of envisioned this idea that he could be the American Godard. He had experience being an actor in Westerns, and he got this idea that they would do this Godardian postmodernism and apply it to Hollywood and apply it to Westerns. And he actually got the screenwriter of Rebel Without a Cause, Stuart Stern, and Dennis Hopper was a supporting cast member of that film, but he couldn't get it made. They needed a biker movie, and him and Peter Fonda had been making some biker movies, so Easy Rider ultimately ended up being his first film. Easy Rider blew up. It was a huge hit, a huge box office hit. So more than just a cultural milestone, that movie made bank. It was a very profitable film, didn't cost a lot, but yet they made a lot. And so suddenly Dennis Hopper was in a position, a great position to be in which he can get any movie he wanted made. However, I still think despite that, and this goes back to what I was saying before, I don't think he was treated with total respect. It was more like the crazy hippie guy, like that's how they probably thought of him. You know, they probably thought of him like the older suits and Hollywood, but they probably thought this crazy hippie guy, Dennis Hopper, he got lucky at that Easy Rider, but it made so much money. Let's give him a chance. Let's see what he comes up with next time. Essentially, the thrust of this narrative is that the last movie, it's a troubled production. I guess we could say troubled. I mean, he got the shots. He made the movie. So, I don't know. To me, it's not too troubled when the film actually is finished. There's a cut of the film that he did that was more linear. When he showed it to people, it got a good response. A similar thing happened with John Cassavetes when editing Husbands. There was a cut of Husbands that he showed people, and it was very well received. And John Cassavetes was like, nah, too easy. If people like it that much, I must be doing something wrong. I'm not challenging the audience enough. So he recut the film to not be as audience friendly. Despite his efforts, that film is still fairly audience friendly. A lot of that's just the trio of those actors, I think. No matter how he cut this film, those guys were going to be so likable and charming and roguish that there was really no way that Husbands wasn't going to be an entertaining film at a certain level. The last movie is kind of a different story. It's a little trickier. It's a trickier movie to begin with. And so when Dennis decided that this early cut that people liked was a little too easy, again, inspired by Godard, this idea that Godard famously was quoted saying a movie should have a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily in that order. Hopper decided to get his Godard on, and why not? He fucking directed Easy Rider. He should. He decided to get his Godard on and make the film non-linear. I would say almost semi-non-linear. It's only non-linear as bookends, which today I don't even think would be considered that iconoclastic. I mean, begins where it ends. Every documentary pretty much follows this format now. So essentially, he takes a part of the ending and puts it at the beginning. And there's a part of the middle that he puts as a coda at the end. But if you're really following this movie and kind of hip to its narrative, that's pretty much it. It's not like a constant non-linear movie. And in fact, that's just a very novelistic approach. Tarantino does that a lot of times in his movies. So I don't think now that would be considered like, oh, so crazy and so non-linear. But this is 1971. This is 1971 and an American film. And as a result, I think a lot of the suits at Universal, which is the studio that was bankrolling this movie, they did not get it. But I think that was not really the biggest thing, and Dennis Hopper didn't think so either. It was more about that it was a satire of Hollywood, and I think the suits kind of looked at it with a very narrow and a kind of knee-jerk attitude where they thought he was like taking the piss out of Hollywood and it was a denouncement of Hollywood. And I don't really think the film is. I think that's definitely an oversimplification. I would only say that about 30 minutes of the film is even really focused on that. Again, like Easy Rider, this is ultimately a story of a maverick just kind of going his own way. I just think the suits were just too square and they just were like, oh, are you making fun of us? You making fun of us? When I don't really think Dennis Hopper was making fun of Hollywood. In fact, I think he was part of Hollywood. He was married into it and he was mentored by James Dean and very noted directors, and he loved Hollywood. He loved the culture of Hollywood, but he also had a sense of humor. If anything, he's making fun of himself. I feel the film is very internally focused and there's a lot of self-deprecation. So I definitely think the suits at Universal misinterpreted the film. They misinterpreted its messaging. I think nowadays most people would be kind of hip and get what he was going for. And I think it would have been better received in later decades. But it was 71. They weren't quite used to something quite like this. God, you think about something like Robert Altman's The Player and things like that, like far more scathing about Hollywood than this film was. But in 1971, they just weren't really used to having the lens pivoted back in their direction. Even though this was a common thing in European cinema by this point, it wasn't done that often in Hollywood. Jerry Lewis did it a little bit in the first half of the 60s, but it wasn't actually done that much by this point. So despite being well received at the Venice Film Festival, this movie, when the Universal suits saw it, they hated it and they pretty much tanked it. They did not promote it. They just released it in a few movie theaters. They essentially killed the movie and killed its chances of catching on. Now, I don't think there's any reality where the last movie was going to do what Easy Rider did. It's not as accessible. It's more obtuse. It's more personal, I think. It's more personal about Dennis Hopper and his experience with Hollywood and balancing his relationship with that industry and his own bohemian maverick leanings as a human being. I roll with, I guess you can say, less obvious narratives better than most people. Maybe because I do love Godard films and Fellini and David Lynch and Wong Kar-wai and Robert Altman and John Cassavetes. Like, yeah, that's kind of my jam. The last movie seems kind of like a normal movie to me. But at the same time, objectively, I can see that it's not a movie for everyone. I do think it would have done better than it did if Universal didn't totally dump it. This movie ruined his career as a director for several years, essentially. And it got him a bad rep in the industry, and he was very angry afterwards. And it didn't help that he was getting deeper into drug use and acting more off-kiltered, and it all kind of culminated with him kind of becoming a pariah for a few years. He ended up living abroad, doing drugs, and it's not until out of the blue in the very late 70s that he climbs out of this hole that he was in for several years, kind of purgatory, because of this movie. And that's normally the mythology that is attached to this film. That all being said, the movie itself, it's a masterpiece. It's amazing. I don't think it's just about Hollywood. If we're talking about Hollywood, like just specifically Hollywood, there are movies that are more focused and make a bigger statement about Hollywood itself. I would say like Sunset Boulevard, Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, probably the greatest. Robert Altman's The Player, which I mentioned, is up there. Blake Edwards' S.O.B. is actually, I think, a very underrated film and a great statement, a great satire. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think Tarantino's best film he ever made. I'm a big fan of that film. All those films, I think, they're like real statements about Hollywood. This film, that's like just part of it. I think it's bigger. It's bigger than Hollywood, and it's a very personal film, perhaps the most personal film Dennis Hopper ever made as a filmmaker. Even though he did have a pro screenwriter help him break the story and write a script, he did kind of go off and discarded the script, and the movie does rely heavily on improvisation, a lot of stuff in the editing room. Again, it's Laszlo Kovac's amazing cinematography. This is a film that's kind of molded and reshaped, and it's really the artist, the visual artist that Dennis Hopper could be. Many times he would say that was his approach with this film, was as a visual artist. The middle section with Don Gordon, the actor, great character actor, supporting actor Don Gordon, who also is great in Out of the Blue. I can't help smiling when I even think of Don Gordon and Dennis Hopper. A little that same manic chemistry that you had with John Cassavetes, Peter Falk, and Ben Gazzara in Husbands. If there is an accessible part of this movie, the last movie, I'd say it's the middle section, where Hopper and Gordon's characters, they're hustlers, and they're down there in Peru, and they're like hustling some rich people to get some money so they can go find some gold. They want to find some gold. And the two of them, Gordon and Hopper, and again, they replicate this again in Out of the Blue. They just had that kind of madcap machismo out of bounds, like unleashed, machismo unleashed, and they're just like two scrappy hustler guys, almost a little cartoonish in the best ways. Like you want to almost see a whole movie about that. I love the whole movie, but I can definitely see that this middle section is the most entertaining part of the movie. Like, if there was a funny gold hunting movie about these two guys, people would have loved that. That probably would have been a very successful follow-up to Easy Rider, but Hopper had a bigger mosaic in his mind. In the same way that the visuals of Easy Rider capture America, this captures Peru and this exotic world. And it's like someone who escapes after exploring America. Now he needs another frontier, he needs another frontier to cross and kind of feel like what America would have felt like in the Old West in the late 19th century. It's similar, like Sam Peckinpah, who I'm also a big fan of. Sam Peckinpah, he loved Mexico because he likened Mexico to what America's Old West was like in the 19th century. Mexico was still like in the middle 20th century. And obviously the same could be said for Peru. Dennis and Kovac's capture the people and the culture of Peru. It's breathtaking stuff. It's beautiful. So it's a high work of art. It's some of the most beautiful cinematography you'll ever see. It really captures the feeling. You feel like you're there. Dennis goes all in. Like, he reveals things about himself that are very personal, and how he could be abusive with women and kind of a hustler and a fucked up maverick that doesn't win in the end. Like, he's almost predicting the film's failure in the movie itself, which is very interesting. It's a profound work of art. It's a profound work of art. It's kind of also, I think, documenting like what happens after Easy Rider. I mean, the thing about Easy Rider, which always interested me, was that it was predicting the failure of the hippie culture in the movie in real time. Like, this was 69. This was even before Altamont. Before the news of the Manson murders hit. This was like during the peak of Woodstock and the peak of hippie idolism. And this is why, like I said earlier, I don't think Dennis was ever a full-fledged hippie or liberal in the traditional sense. If you look at the content of the films, and especially Easy Rider, and then even more especially the last movie, he seems to be acknowledging the failure of the revolution, essentially. And like, what do you do after the revolution fails? You go off and you hide. You become an expatriate. You're hiding in Peru. You're trying to find something maybe earthier and more spiritual. You're trying to escape the system because you've already acknowledged that you can't beat the system. You can't beat the system, so you're trying to escape the system. There's a coda or epilogue to the last movie that I feel I should talk about, which is the American Dreamer documentary of 1971, the same year it came out. Now, Dennis Hopper himself did not direct this, at least not officially. He did not direct this, but still, it's worth talking about, especially in context of the last movie, because it's definitely a companion piece to it. It was directed by L.M. Kit Carson and Lawrence Schiller. This was during post-production of the last movie when Dennis had relocated. He was living in Tejas, Mexico, where they shot a couple scenes of Easy Rider, and Dennis fell in love with it while they were shooting those scenes there. So he moved to this really awesome, like kind of frontier style home. Dennis was living it up in this big home in Mexico, and all of post-production for the last movie was happening in this house. The final editing of the film was all done in this house, and this documentary chronicles that process. So we actually see Dennis Hopper and the editor putting together the final cut of the film. But the main focus is really Dennis's bohemian counterculture lifestyle that he was living at the time. Now, there's a lot of people that might be put off by this and just think, oh, he's trying to turn himself into this Charles Manson-like guru, and Manson is discussed. And Dennis definitely seems to be taking a page from Manson, and there is this harem of young hippie women. However, as it was revealed decades later from the filmmakers, a lot of this was a bit of show. A show courtesy of Dennis Hopper. As an actor, he was presenting himself in a way that he thought seemed pretty cool and awesome. And he said that they already had decided that the documentary was going to be called The American Dreamer. So he wanted to kind of present that, the American dream, what the American dream might be for a young man living in 1971. So of course that would include a harem of young hippie women who for the most part all seem game and enjoying themselves, and it seems rather consensual. Probably the most notorious scene is there's a scene in the documentary when you see Dennis Hopper having sex with two of these women in a bathtub. They're having a threesome, and it does get relatively explicit in spots. So essentially, it's a real life sex scene that he's acting out. But the whole thing has a meta quality to it. And especially thinking about how this is working alongside the last movie, which was also very meta in nature, it's hard not to think that Dennis Hopper is playing a role here. Dennis also, in future years, whenever it was shown at film festivals, Dennis would request that this documentary would also be shown alongside with it because he felt that they did work together. After the failure of the last movie, this documentary made things worse because it made him look like he was this crazy, decadent, Manson-like character. He's essentially a pariah. No one wants to work with him. It's not until the late 70s he has a small role in Apocalypse Now, which he's great in. But it's not really until this next film, out of the blue, that he comes back again. Out of the blue, it was an independent Canadian production, and he was cast as an actor. He was just the girl's dad in it. Then the director dropped off, or he was fired. I forget the exact details, but they didn't have a director anymore. And Dennis, being the cagey hustler that he is, not dissimilar to his character Kansas in the last movie, he pounced on the situation like a fucking man. Like a man. He pounced on the situation, and he took over the whole project. No, more than a man, like a conqueror, like Alexander the Great. Like, he took over this project. There was a weakness. There was a weakness in the project, and he seized it, and it became his project. So he goes from being a supporting actor in the movie to seizing it like a conqueror and making it his fucking movie. He rewrites the script. He actually rewrote it in a weekend. Being an actor himself, he saw something really special in the young actress Linda Mons, and he wanted to kind of tailor the movie a little bit more to her. word. That's part of it. I think, that sounds nice when he's talking to the press, maybe. But I think ultimately it was more about just going in a darker, more gonzo, fucked up direction that he himself wanted to go into. And he was very inspired by the Neil Young song Out of the Blue, the one that opens Neil Young's amazing Rust Never Sleeps. And that album is bookended by Out of the Blue. And actually, after consulting my vinyl copy of Rust Never Sleeps, you gotta forgive me here, even though this is one of my favorite songs, well, two of my favorite songs from one of my favorite albums, I am a little bit into the whiskey. Rust Never Sleeps opens up with my, hey, hey, in parentheses, Out of the Blue. All right, that's the acoustic version of this classic Neil Young jam. And then the album ends with, hey, hey, my, in parentheses, Into the Black. You got it? So it's like a mirror reflection. And this is a great album, by the way. My idea of a fun date night is this album and this movie. They work so well together. One day I might meet a woman who would think that's a great date night too. And we'll love each other, get married, and then maybe get a divorce in like 10 years. Anyway, that digression aside, it seemed like Dennis preferred my, hey, hey, because that's the only version of the song he uses in the movie, and the movie is called Out of the Blue. And I have to say, as much as I do love Hey, Hey, My, Into the Black, I do also prefer, like Dennis Hopper, the moody acoustic version of the song. The song references Elvis because Elvis had died recently when Neil Young wrote it, and Elvis's death coincided with the rise of punk rock and the Sex Pistols, so Neil Young acutely made that parallel. A lot of the punk rockers, they negated a lot of 60s rock, especially late 60s rock. And Elvis was a big part of punk rock, actually. I mean, of course, the Clash's London Calling album evokes Elvis's first album cover. Dennis and Neil Young were both like hip to that. The punk rock was trying to return rock to its primitive roots, its primitive Sun Records roots. Dennis was a very hip guy who plugs into a zeitgeist in a moment, and he kind of plugged into that. And it's interesting, as a guy who made Easy Rider like the ultimate statement of late 60s rock and roll hippiedom, he was hip to how the hippies weren't hip anymore. Like I said, he was never really of the hippies, just more like in there, entrenched as a photographer, the way he always was. He was clued into what they were about, and he could talk with the hippies, but he was never really of them. If anything, I feel this aesthetic reflected more of who he was. In his soul, he was a little more proto-punk rock. So I feel like that's something he could connect with. In the same way that punk rock was both progressive and reactionary at the same time, Dennis Hopper was. He was both progressive and reactionary at the same time. Believe it or not, everything I'm talking about has to do with this movie. He takes this cue from Out of the Blue, Neil Young's. He makes it the theme of the movie. He makes it about this young, troubled girl that's into Elvis, who's bummed out because Elvis died, and who's also into punk rock. It's an amazing performance by Linda Mons. Sharon Farrell is also very good as her mother. And as I said earlier, Don Gordon is in the film again. These guys just lock in together, and they are amazing together. The movie opens with Hopper's character is a truck driver, and he's with his daughter, and already you get a sense that they have an inappropriate relationship. But he's been drinking. He's drinking while he's driving the truck, and he smashes into a bus filled with elementary school children, and he kills them all. Well, I don't know if he kills them all. He kills a lot of them. He kills a lot of the kids. Kind of an opposite of a Save the Cat moment. It's what I call a kill a school bus of children moment. As a screenwriter, I think those are important moments to have in a movie because it's the flip side to a Save the Cat moment, because it makes you go, holy shit, what the fuck's going on with this movie? I need to keep watching. To find out where this film's going. So I think it's important to have a kill a school bus filled with children moment in a movie. I think it really makes you lean in and get interested in the narrative. So then he goes to prison, and it's about how his daughter and his wife and how they're living without him. But then in the middle of the movie, he comes back, he's out of jail, and there's this amazing scene in the middle. They're having this welcoming party, and he's in the kitchen, and a couple of the angry fathers, led by this one father of the kids that he killed, confronts him in the house, and Hopper's character's all drunk, and it's like, am I going to have to talk to every asshole dad about this. The performance, you could tell there was a lot of improv in the scene, because after his outpouring and screaming at the guy, Hopper's going in a different direction. He sits down and he's like, hey, let's have a drink. He's going in that direction as an actor. And Doc Gordon stands up. He's like, fuck you, get out of here. And then Hopper like taps into this. Suddenly he gets hardcore again. He jumps up. He's like, yeah, fuck you. And they chase the guy out. You can see the improv like in motion in the movie. And it's an exciting moment. And even though I feel like it's kind of a mistake, I feel like Hopper, being Hopper, decided to keep it in because it was just so visceral and exciting. It could be my single favorite scene in a Dennis Hopper directed movie. It's amazing. And the whole movie, it goes to a lot of really dark places. The end is very dark. I don't want to reveal too much, but Hopper's character suddenly takes a real kind of proto-Frank Booth turn, let's just say, where he's kind of the ultimate evil, perverted guy. And the way he's getting on his knees and acting like with his daughter is very similar to some of the scenes he has in Blue Velvet. As much of a genius as David Lynch is, and I think he's one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century, I think David Lynch was taking a little bit of a cue from Dennis Hopper. You could definitely see that what Frank Booth was in Blue Velvet, a lot of that did come from Hopper in himself as a performer and artist. And I think David Lynch was smart enough to let Dennis do his thing. You see him getting to that here already, this 1980 film, years before Blue Velvet, that he's already doing some Frank Booth shit. This was kind of a lost film. Like, when people saw it, like, critics, like, acknowledged that it was a really good and powerful and visceral film, but it never really got a wide release, and it essentially became like a forgotten movie. And, you know, because it didn't take off and wasn't a hit, again, Dennis Hopper was kind of put in director jail, and he put his focus on being an actor. Eventually, this would lead to Blue Velvet, and he got such acclaim for that movie, as he should have, that it made him a high in-demand actor again, and he got his shit together. Even though he was always a very artistic bohemian guy, he kicked drugs, he was clean and sober, but amazingly he kept his manic edge, and he directed the film Colors, Sean Penn and Robert Duvall. Great film, really great film. I love it. I'm not really going to dive into it. A, I don't own it, and B, I think it's essentially like a journeyman assignment job. Like, it showed that Dennis Hopper could just do a straightforward commercial movie where he takes his personality kind of aside and just focuses on the story that needs to be told. But he has this great eye for what real Los Angeles was like at the time. And in the same way he picked up on the hippie subculture and rock and roll culture in Easy Rider, and then punk rock in Out of the Blue, he's hip to LA gangster rap in 1988. And this film was before Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. So it's a very innovative film. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it would be like the first mainstream movie that dealt with the Bloods and Crips, you know, the whole gang scene in LA in the late 80s. Hopper's this hip guy. He was right there. And it's a great film, but it's an assignment job, and he just did it really well. Showed that Hopper was just a great director. He could just be a director. Then he followed it up with this film, Backtrack. And this is the last film that I'm going to be diving into. I'll do a brief mention of his other two films afterwards. But Backtrack, which is a complicated film, which I'm going to get into after I take a break. Hey, I'm back. Yeah, I'm back after eating a delicious chicken burrito. And I've shifted to the beer. I like to shift to beer after drinking a little whiskey. In fact, the beer I happen to have in my fridge. Check this out. Yep, Pabst Blue Ribbon. All right, Dennis Hopper fans, they get that. They get that. Backtrack. Yes, now we're going to talk about Backtrack. This fucking movie. In fact, that's a good way to describe this movie. This fucking movie. What's going on with Backtrack? Okay, it's complicated. All right, even more complicated and sorted in many ways than the last movie. This was a big year for him. 1990, he did two movies. He directed The Hot Spot, which I will touch upon after talking about Backtrack. In this movie, Backtrack, he actually made this film, Backtrack, first, but I believe The Hot Spot actually was released a few months before this one. This one, Backtrack, was a troubled production. When it first came out, it had the title Catchfire, which I actually prefer. I prefer the title Catchfire. I wish the director's cut was called Catchfire. It makes more sense with the movie, I think, actually. But for some reason, this movie's called Backtrack, and that is the director's cut. It's called Backtrack. Now, the director's cut is definitely the preferred version. It's the one everyone should watch. It's the one Dennis wanted you to watch, and it is the better film. The script had a lot of revisions. There were several drafts, several different writers on it. Dennis Hopper kind of puts it all together. He had issues with the star, Jodie Foster. They didn't really click, and she ended up not liking him and thought he was a dictator. She was uncomfortable with some of the material, some of the more salacious material of the film. Generally speaking, they didn't really click. You can kind of see it in parts of the movie as well. So Jodie Foster, and this is an interesting time for Jodie Foster because it's actually between her two biggest roles. It's after she got the Oscar for The Accused, but 1 year before she would do Silence of the Lambs, which I think is her best performance, and she got an Oscar for that as well. So this is a sandwich between two Oscar-winning roles for her. I feel like there's no way she would have done this film after Silence of the Lambs. And it's funny because you get a sense that while she's doing it, she's feeling kind of like, why did I do this movie after The Accused? She plays an artist, a conceptual artist, more on that in a bit, who sees a killing, a hit from the mafia. So Jodie sees this murder. She's on the run now. She doesn't trust the cops, yet she doesn't want to be killed by gangsters. So she takes it on herself to have these different identities and moves around. And so it's kind of like she's on the lam while still wanting to express herself as an artist. You could see why Dennis Hopper would connect with this material. I'm sure a lot of the stuff involving the art world and her being a conceptual artist came from Dennis. I'm sure that's something he had one of the screenwriters put into the script because that's totally him. And he was still very into the art scene. And conceptual artists, he was very popular during this time period. Jenny Holzer, they actually just used her work. They used Jenny Holzer's work in it, which was primarily one of the things she did was she used LED lighting, like signs, like the kind of stuff you saw in Times Square with like the ticker. She would use these LED signs, but instead of saying like commercial things or things plugging things or the news, they would say evocative or personal or revealing things. The advertisement and news world clashing with our deep personal desires that we don't always like to reveal in public spaces. Cool stuff. I'm a fan, and obviously Dennis was a fan too. The character that Jodie Foster plays is essentially a stand-in for Jenny Holzer, and she's using that work in it. So it's like if Jenny Holzer saw some mobsters kill someone and then she's on the run, Dennis's character is a hitman that's hired to track her down, and he's following her, and he gets obsessed with her artwork. And he himself, he's a very artsy bohemian hitman who likes to play the saxophone, plays the saxophone. He likes Charlie Parker. He's into art himself. He's got a lot of paintings in his place, and he buys one of her installation pieces, one of her installation signs he has plugged in. He gets a voice diary of hers that she recorded on a tape that she was sending to a friend, but he gets it instead. And he becomes obsessed with her, and he falls in love with her before he even meets her because he's an offbeat, artsy guy, and she's an offbeat, artsy gal. So naturally, he's going to be drawn to her. The supporting cast is crazy. And this is because Dennis Hopper, especially by this point, Dennis had really been welcomed back into Hollywood, especially after Blue Velvet. He was once again a hip fixture in Hollywood culture. You could tell by just the supporting cast that he put together. Charlie Sheen's in it. John Turturro, Vincent Price, Bob Dylan, fucking Bob Dylan. Joe Pesci playing a gangster, what do you know? Tony Sirico, the great Tony Sirico, who played my favorite character on The Sopranos, Paulie Walnuts, he's in it, playing a gangster, what do you know? Dean Stockwell, who is also a friend of Dennis Hopper, who had a role in the last movie, and also was in Blue Velvet, and played a friend of Frank Booth's in that movie, who also enjoyed a good Pabst Blue Ribbon from time to time. Jodie Foster is a great actor, and I think she's always interesting to watch, but for Jodie Foster, it's an unusually inconsistent performance. Like, there are times where it really works, and there's other times where you can see, especially with Dennis, some of the scenes where he is first kidnapping her, his character's kidnapping her, and there's supposed to be tension between the two. It works really well, but later on, after they're supposed to be romantic together and that tension evaporates, it's a little more forced. She does a lot of laughing and smiling. I think this is a role that it would have benefited if it was an actress that he was romantically involved with. It's that kind of role where I think you need to give 100% of yourself to, and you need to feel comfortable with the director in that sense. like Anna Karina with Jean-Luc Godard or Teresa Russell with Nicholas Roeg. It kind of needed, I think, a performance like that, like a muse, a proper director muse. I would say that's like one of the main flaws of the film. And this film, I would call a flawed masterpiece. It's a flawed masterpiece, but there is a masterpiece in this film. There's a lot of great stuff. It's kind of like the last full-on 100% Dennis Hopper film. Not to say that The Hot Spot isn't a really good film, and I do enjoy it, but that feels a little more like he's trying to rein himself in and do something a little more professional. Whereas this is just him being gonzo again. The most gonzo since Out of the Blue. Definitely watch the director's cut. This edition, this Blu-ray edition with the title Backtrack is what I recommend. The director's cut, it's not like there's too many new scenes. It's more just that the scenes are longer and there's more room for them to breathe in the director's cut. And as a result, things don't feel quite as rushed and scattershot as they do in the theatrical cut. The director's cut is generally the one that you will see now on streaming and stuff. That is kind of the canonized version of the film. This is the kind of film that the first time you watch it, you're kind of like, what the fuck? This is kind of a bad film, but I'm enjoying it. It's campy. It goes places that you don't expect it to go to. And then the more times you watch it, the more you appreciate it. The first time I watched it was before I saw the last movie. After watching the last movie, suddenly this film made more sense. And I could see how this was the same filmmaker. And even though he wasn't quite at the top of his game, I can see the artistry to it. And I could see that this was, again, kind of a Godardian take of a gangster movie. It was him putting his postmodern spin on it, his unique Hopper-esque spin on it. The Hot Spot, which he made the same year, I'll just touch on briefly, starring Don Johnson, Virginia Madsen, and Jennifer Connelly, is a great film as well. I really enjoy that film. I don't actually own a copy. I just rewatched it last week, and it holds up really well. If anything, it's a little bit of a hybrid. That's a hybrid of Hopper kind of doing his journeyman. I'm just trying to direct like a mainstream movie. So it's a little bit of that color side, but he is mixing in a little of his Gonzo Hopper stuff into it, and it has a lot of passion and sexuality to it. I think it's one of Don Johnson's strongest roles, and I'm a big Don Johnson fan overall. The Hot Spot, if like the Coen brothers had directed it, everyone would be talking up this movie. It'd be like considered one of the best movies. In my opinion, it's better than Blood Simple. I think The Hot Spot's a really strong movie. Another example to show that when he really wanted to and he put his mind to it, he could do a kind of slick, well-made, well-constructed, mainstream motion picture. And I think The Hot Spot's another great example of that. His last film was a film in 1994 called Chasers, which I've never seen. I just watched Chasers a few nights ago while I was editing this video. First time I ever watched it. It's on Amazon Prime, so check it out if you want to check it out. It was a little bit better than I was expecting, but it was more or less what I was expecting. It is indeed a screwball comedy. Not a bad film. I can get why it did not do well. It was a big bomb. For some reason, Warner Brothers decided to invest some money in Dennis Hopper at this point in the mid-90s. This was like a $15 million movie, only made $1 million at the box office. I'm guessing it was a well-received script. Dan Gilroy, the renowned screenwriter and also writer-director of the movie Nightcrawler, was actually one of the writers on the script. It happened one night, meets Bring Up Baby, meets The Last Detail. I could see why Dennis Hopper would want to direct this, and this was a chance for him to do another kind of mainstream studio film while putting his eccentric stamp on it, and I think you could definitely see it in places where the Dennis Hopper factor comes in, but this is his weakest film in my opinion, and he was probably not thrilled a couple years later when he looked back and realized this was his last movie. It doesn't seem like a movie someone makes thinking it's going to be their last movie, but nonetheless, it's his last movie. It definitely has the least amount of depth of any Dennis Hopper film. You do see these little moments where Dennis Hopper's personality comes through, especially on the periphery when you're seeing the culture of South Carolina. Because like he always was great at doing, from his photography to his filmmaking, Dennis Hopper is great at capturing Americana. the real America. And you definitely see glimpses of that throughout this film, and that's probably the most enjoyable part of the movie, in my opinion, is actually seeing a real reflection of 1990s South Carolina. If you're a fan of like Hal Needham / Burt Reynolds movies like I am, it's a fun film. It's an entertaining film. I would actually recommend Chasers, which ends up, interestingly enough, being a chaser. It is a chaser to the Dennis Hopper directorial filmography. They don't make him like Dennis Hopper anymore. They don't do it. He was a one-of-a-kind, purely American artist. And that's the thing. Dennis Hopper valued art in the broadest sense, in terms of photography, in terms of visual and conceptual art, in terms of filmmaking, in terms of acting. He believed in the value of art, and I think that's something that is getting to be less valued in our society. But to me, being passionate about art is a good characteristic for a human being. And I think as years go by and people go back and look at the last movie and Out of the Blue, I think people will see how strong of a filmmaker Dennis Hopper was and how complicated and expansive and passionate his vision was. Despite my thumbnail making it a question, it doesn't really have to be or. You can be, and oftentimes are, can be a madman and a genius. And I think Dennis Hopper was a madman and genius. So I'm Edwin Canistracci, and until next time, rock and roll.